My name is Elena Rose Martinez. I'm 32 years old, and 2 months after my grandmother died, my parents invited me to their upscale downtown Boston condo for what they called a family celebration. They had champagne chilling in a crystal bucket, an elaborate spread from the most expensive Italian caterer in the city, which felt like mockery given that my Nonna Sofia had spent her life making that food with her own hands, and they were practically vibrating with excitement. Halfway through the appetizers, my father Richard stood up, cleared his throat like he was about to give a toast at a corporate gala, and announced that they'd sold my grandmother's house for $1.35 million. They were smiling, actually beaming with pride like they'd just closed the deal of the century. My mother Diana reached across the table, squeezed my hand with her perfectly manicured fingers, and said in that voice she uses when she's explaining the world to people she considers naive, "After all the fees and estate expenses, Elena honey, your portion is $485,000. We've already set up a meeting with our financial advisor to help you invest it properly, so you don't do anything foolish with it." What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, is that 4 years before my grandmother died, she'd transferred that house into my name. Legal deed transfer, properly recorded with Suffolk County, completely binding and irrevocable, which meant every document they'd signed as executor, every contract they'd negotiated with those developers, every dollar they'd accepted, all of it was fraud. They'd just sold property they didn't own, and they sat there in their designer clothes, expecting me to thank them for destroying my grandmother's legacy and handing me blood money from their crime. My grandmother knew this would happen. She told me it would. 3 days before she died, lying in her bed with cancer eating through her body, she pressed a thick manila envelope into my hands and said in Italian, "Let them show you who they are first, cara mia. Then you will know what must be done." So I let them. I watched them spend 2 months planning the demolition of the house where my grandmother had lived for 60 years, the house where she'd raised 3 children as a widow, the house where she'd taught me to make pasta from scratch and grow tomatoes in the backyard garden, and understand that real wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts. I watched them hire contractors to measure the property for a luxury condo development. I watched them celebrate selling my house, with champagne and imported prosciutto. And then I pulled out that envelope and watched their entire world collapse in the most spectacular legal disaster they could never have imagined. Before I take you back to that moment, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Then drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I want to know who's here with me, who understands what it means to fight for what matters, even when your own family becomes the enemy. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the house at 47 Maple Street, and the woman who built her entire life there, with nothing but determination and love. The house where my Nonna Sofia lived wasn't impressive by modern standards, a modest 2-bedroom colonial built in 1963, with peeling paint, an outdated kitchen, a small backyard garden, and absolutely no curb appeal, according to my mother's professional opinion. But that house was everything to Sofia Castellano. She'd bought it in 1965 for $18,000, working 3 jobs after my grandfather died suddenly, and left her with 3 young children and overwhelming debt. She'd paid it off in 12 years, every single mortgage payment made on time, through sheer determination and sacrifice. That house sat in what was once a working-class Italian neighborhood in Boston, but over the decades the area had transformed into one of the most desirable locations in the city, where developers salivated over every property, and young professionals paid millions for renovated homes. Sofia's house, sitting on a prime corner lot, was worth well over $1 million just for the land. But to her, it wasn't an asset, or an investment, or wasted potential. It was the physical embodiment of everything she'd survived and achieved. The proof that a young immigrant woman from Naples could come to America with nothing and build something permanent. My parents saw that house completely differently, and the difference in their vision versus Sofia's vision was the difference between them as human beings. Richard Martinez, who'd been born Ricardo Castellano and changed his name at 18 to sound less ethnic, had spent his entire adult life trying to distance himself from what he called his poor immigrant upbringing. He changed his appearance, his accent, even the way he walked and talked, all to fit into Boston's elite real estate development circles, where old money and new money mingled, and nobody wanted to be reminded of working-class origins. My mother, Diana, came from actual old money, one of those Boston families with trust funds going back generations. And she'd married my father partly because his ambition and hunger matched her own need to always be climbing higher on whatever social ladder she'd fixated on that season. Together, they'd built a real estate empire that specialized in luxury developments, and they'd cultivated an image of generational wealth that conveniently erased the fact that Richard had grown up in a 2-bedroom house with 6 people sharing 1 bathroom. Sophia's house embarrassed them. The peeling paint, the overgrown tomato plants in the garden, the outdated appliances, the lace curtains, the religious statues, the whole aesthetic of working-class Italian immigrant, all of it screamed everything they'd spent decades trying to escape and hide from their wealthy friends and business associates. But I loved that house with my whole heart. Loved it the way you love the place that shaped who you are and taught you what matters. While my parents visited Sophia maybe 3 times a year on obligatory holidays, staying for exactly 90 minutes and spending most of that time checking their phones and making comments about how she really should update the kitchen or at least paint the exterior, I came every single week, sometimes twice a week. I spent countless afternoons in Sophia's kitchen, learning to make pasta by hand, rolling the dough until my arms ached, learning the exact texture it should have before you cut it, understanding through my hands and her hands guiding mine that cooking wasn't just following recipes. It was connection, tradition, love made tangible. She taught me to grow basil and tomatoes and oregano in her small garden, explaining in her mix of Italian and English how you had to talk to plants, encourage them, treat them like family. We'd sit at her kitchen table for hours while she told me stories about Naples, about coming to America at 22 with nothing but a battered suitcase and her mother's recipes written in a notebook she still kept in a drawer, about meeting my grandfather and building a life and raising 3 children while working 3 jobs after he died, about every sacrifice and struggle and small victory that had led to this house, this life, this moment of us sitting together, drinking espresso she made in the same mocha pot she'd brought from Italy 60 years ago. Sophia's philosophy was simple, and it shaped everything about how I saw the world. Real wealth, cara mia, is not in your bank account. It's in your heart, your hands, what you create, and who you love. She'd say this while kneading bread dough, while pruning tomato plants, while folding my hands in hers. She lived that philosophy every single day. She didn't need granite countertops or stainless steel appliances or open floor plans or any of the things my mother was always pushing her to install. She needed her garden, where she grew the vegetables for Sunday sauce. She needed her kitchen, where 3 generations had learned to cook. She needed the living room, where we gathered for holidays and told the same stories over and over, because the repetition was the point, because that's how you build tradition and pass it forward. She needed roots and memory and connection, and that house held all of it, like a vessel holding something sacred that couldn't be replaced or replicated or improved with money. When Sophia was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer at 86 years old, the doctors told us she had maybe 3 to 4 months, if we were lucky. During those months, my parents made their obligatory visits, brief, uncomfortable, focused entirely on what they called final arrangements, which really meant making sure Sophia's will was updated and properly executed so there wouldn't be any complications when she died. They never asked about her pain, her fears, her memories, what she needed emotionally. They asked about documents and accounts and whether she'd considered selling the house before she died to simplify things for everyone. I took a leave of absence from the bakery where I worked as a pastry chef, packed a bag, and moved into Sophia's guest room, I cooked her favorite foods, even though chemotherapy had destroyed her appetite, and she could barely eat 3 bites of anything. I managed her medications, drove her to treatments, sat beside her through long, painful nights when morphine couldn't quite touch the deeper aches, held her hand, and sang Italian lullabies she'd sung to me as a child. We talked about everything during those months: her childhood in Naples, her journey to America, every memory she wanted to make sure I carried forward, every recipe she wanted to make sure I'd perfected, every piece of wisdom she'd learned through 86 years of living with intention and love. 3 days before Sophia died, on a quiet morning when late autumn sunlight filtered through the lace curtains she'd hung 40 years ago, she asked me to bring her a specific box from her bedroom closet. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold anything, her body ravaged by the cancer and the treatments that hadn't worked. But her eyes were still sharp and clear and fierce with purpose. Inside the box was a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax, my name written across the front in Sophia's distinctive handwriting that had stayed elegant and careful, despite arthritis and age. She pressed it into my hands with more strength than I thought she still had. "I did this 4 years ago," she said in Italian, her voice weak but absolutely certain. "Before the cancer, when my mind was clear and my lawyer could witness everything properly. The house, I transferred it to you, Elena. All legal, all recorded with the county, all official and binding. But I never told your father because I knew what he would do if he knew." My hands went numb. The envelope felt impossibly heavy. "Nonna, I can't accept this. It's too much. Papa he'll never forgive me if he finds out you did this." "Your father will do exactly what I know he will do," Sophia interrupted, her grip on my wrist tightening. "He will see money and opportunity and development potential. He will want to sell immediately, tear down this house, build something modern and expensive, split the profit and forget this place ever existed. He won't understand that some things matter more than market value, that some places hold more than just financial worth." Tears were streaming down my face, dripping onto the envelope and making dark spots on the paper. "I know, Nonna. I know what it means. I know what this house is." "That's why I give it to you," Sophia said, and now she was crying too. "Because you understand. You're the only one who understands that this house is our story, our family, our heart. You know that the kitchen where I taught you to cook is worth more than any amount of money. You know that the garden where we grew tomatoes together holds more value than any development could create. You see what your father is blind to, that memory and tradition and love are the real inheritance, not property value and profit margins." She pulled me closer, her face inches from mine, her eyes burning with an intensity that made me forget for a second that she was dying. "I give this to you because I trust you to protect it. Maybe you will live here someday. Maybe you will keep it exactly as it is. Maybe someday far in the future you will sell it, but it will be your choice, made with love and understanding and respect for what this place means, not greed or embarrassment or the need to erase your history to feel successful." She took a shaking breath. "Keep this envelope safe. Don't tell your parents yet. Let them show you who they are first. Let them reveal themselves without knowing they're being tested. Then you will know what must be done. Promise me, cara mia." I promised through tears and held her while she cried and told me again and again that I was her true family, that blood didn't mean anything if there was no love and respect to go with it, that she was proud of me, that she loved me more than any words could express. Sophia Castellano died peacefully 3 days later on a cold November morning, with me holding her hand and singing Torna a Sorrento, the way she'd sung it to me when I was small and couldn't sleep. The funeral was enormous. Old neighbors from the original Italian community who'd known her for decades, former coworkers from the garment factory where she'd worked her second job, Members of St. Anthony's Church, where she'd attended Mass every Sunday for 60 years. People whose lives she'd touched through small kindnesses and big sacrifices, and the simple act of being genuinely present for others. My parents organized everything with corporate efficiency, hiring the most expensive funeral home, the best caterer, sending engraved programs like it was a charity gala instead of a goodbye to a woman who'd valued simplicity and authenticity above all else. I delivered the eulogy in both English and Italian, barely able to speak through grief that felt like drowning, trying to describe a woman who'd taught me that love was an action, not just a feeling, that wealth was measured in what you gave, not what you accumulated, that the best life was one built on connection and memory, and food shared with people you treasured. My parents cried for the cameras and the guests, their grief performative and hollow, already thinking ahead to estate settlement and property sales, and finally getting their hands on that valuable real estate their embarrassing immigrant mother had stubbornly refused to monetize. The will reading happened 1 week later, at the office of Maria Constantino, Sophia's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd known my grandmother for 20 years and clearly loved her. Maria's office was old-school professional, dark wood furniture, walls lined with law books, the kind of place that felt trustworthy and permanent. She read through Sophia's will with careful precision, small bequests to St. Anthony's Church and the Italian Community Center, Sophia's jewelry divided among her grandchildren, personal items distributed to specific friends, with notes explaining why each person was receiving what they received. And then the main estate. The house at 47 Maple Street and its contents, plus associated savings accounts, to be divided equally between my son, Richard Martinez, and my granddaughter, Elena Rose Martinez. My parents exchanged looks across the conference table, satisfied, relieved, already calculating. Equal split meant they could finally sell, finally develop that prime property, finally stop being embarrassed by the peeling paint and overgrown garden. I watched my mother's fingers move slightly, like she was doing math on an invisible calculator. I watched my father's shoulders relax, as tension he'd been carrying for years melted away. Maria noticed their expressions too. I caught her glancing at them with something that looked like distaste. And when her eyes met mine, there was the briefest moment of what I can only describe as solidarity. A slight nod that told me she knew something they didn't, and she was on my side. The first months after Sophia died, I couldn't function at all. Grief hit me in waves that left me unable to breathe, unable to work, unable to do anything except cry and sleep and wake up crying again. I couldn't face the house. Every corner would hold memories that would destroy me. Sophia's presence so strong in every room that I knew walking through that door would break whatever was holding me together. My parents, meanwhile, wasted absolutely no time. I found out later that they'd started making calls the day after the funeral, contacting property assessors and development companies and architects before Sophia's body was even cold. 2 weeks after she died, my mother called me. "Elena, sweetie, we need you to come by the house on Saturday. There are some people we want you to meet, developers who are very interested in the property. We're exploring options, and we want to make sure you're part of the process." I should have gone. I should have stopped them right then. But I was drowning in grief, and I couldn't face that house yet. Couldn't bear to see strangers walking through Sophia's kitchen with measuring tapes and calculators. So I said I wasn't ready, and asked them to please wait a few more weeks before making any decisions. My mother's voice took on that edge it always had when I wasn't cooperating with her plans. "Elena, I understand you're emotional. You and Sophia were very close, but we can't let sentiment prevent us from making smart financial decisions. The house is empty, it's costing money every month in utilities and taxes and insurance, and the market is extremely hot right now. Waiting could cost us tens of thousands of dollars if market conditions change." "It's been 2 weeks since the funeral," I said, my voice breaking. "Can't we just take a little time to—" "We've given you time," she interrupted. "But your father is executor of the estate, and he has fiduciary responsibilities. We're moving forward with property assessments and development consultations, whether you participate or not. It would be better if you were involved, but it's your choice." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my apartment feeling steamrolled and helpless and furious, but still too grief-stricken to fight back. So I let them proceed. I let them show me exactly who they were, exactly what Sophia had predicted, exactly why she'd protected the house the way she had. 6 weeks after Sophia died, I finally forced myself to visit the house because my father had left 3 increasingly annoyed voicemails saying I needed to come sign some preliminary paperwork and meet with the estate attorney. I drove to 47 Maple Street on a gray Saturday morning with my stomach in knots. And what I found when I pulled up made me physically sick. There were contractors everywhere, men with measuring equipment walking the perimeter of the property, someone taking photographs of the house from every angle, a woman in expensive business attire reviewing architectural plans spread across the hood of a luxury sedan, and my parents, standing in the driveway, talking to a man in a suit, all of them laughing like they were at a cocktail party, instead of planning the destruction of my grandmother's legacy. I got out of my car slowly, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to understand how they could move this fast and this far without even consulting me. "Oh good, you're finally here," my mother said when she noticed me, her tone suggesting I was late to something I'd agreed to attend, rather than ambushed by something I'd specifically asked them not to do. "We wanted to show you the preliminary plans. The developers are offering $1.3 million for the property as is, or we could partner with them on the full development for a percentage of unit sales, which the projections suggest could net us significantly more over time. We're leaning toward the partnership option." She gestured to the architectural renderings spread across a folding table someone had set up in the driveway. I looked at the slick computer-generated images, showing a modern glass and steel building, 4 stories tall, with luxury condos and ground-floor retail space, rising from the exact spot where Sophia's house currently stood. They'd already named it the Castellano, using my grandmother's name for a development that would erase everything she'd built and stood for. The irony was so brutal I almost laughed. "You're going to tear it down," I said, my voice coming out flat and dead. "Obviously," my father said with that impatient tone he always used when explaining things he thought should be obvious. "The structure itself is worthless, Elena. It's 60 years old with outdated everything. The value is entirely in the location and the land. Demolition is already scheduled for next month, pending final permit approvals. We're moving fast to capitalize on current market conditions." He pulled out his phone and showed me a timeline. "Your share of the initial payment will be around $450,000, which is incredibly generous money for someone your age. Diana and I have already arranged meetings with our financial advisor to help you invest it properly so you don't squander it on something foolish." I stared at the renderings, at the sleek, modern building that would replace Sophia's kitchen, her garden, every physical trace of her existence. "I asked you to wait," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I specifically asked you to give me time before making any major decisions. Nonna just died. Can't we take a few months to—" "Elena, sweetie, emotions can't drive financial decisions," Diana interrupted in that infuriatingly patronizing tone she'd perfected, the voice she used with subordinates and service workers, and anyone she considered less sophisticated than herself. "I know you're grieving, and you have sentimental attachment to this property, but keeping an empty house costs real money. Utilities, taxes, insurance, maintenance. It adds up quickly, and the market is hot right now. In 6 months, conditions could change, interest rates could rise, development costs could increase. Your grandmother worked hard to build this asset, and she'd want us to be smart about maximizing its value, not letting sentiment cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars." "You didn't know what Nonna wanted," I said quietly, and something in my tone made my mother's smile falter slightly. "You barely knew her at all. When's the last time you had a real conversation with her? that wasn't about trying to convince her to sell this house or update her kitchen or stop embarrassing you with her working-class Italian immigrant aesthetic. My father's face darkened dangerously.
She was my mother. Don't you dare suggest I didn't know her.
Then tell me her favorite meal, I challenged. Tell me the name of the town in Italy where she grew up. Tell me why she planted those specific roses in the garden. Tell me the story of how she paid for this house working 3 jobs after Nonno died. Tell me, literally, anything about her that isn't related to property value and inheritance. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. They couldn't answer a single question because they'd never bothered to ask. Never bothered to see Sophia as anything more than an aging parent with valuable real estate they'd eventually inherit. That's what I thought, I said. This house meant everything to her, and you didn't even know why. So don't tell me what she would have wanted, because what she wanted was for her home to be valued for what it represented, not just what it was worth. And you're incapable of understanding that difference. My father's voice went cold and hard. I'm the executor of this estate, and I have legal authority to manage these assets as I see fit. The house will be sold. The development will proceed. You'll get your share of the money whether you approve or not. That's final. Now, are you going to be a productive part of this process, or are you going to continue being difficult and emotional? I left before I said something I couldn't take back, before I pulled out the envelope and ended everything right there in the driveway. But Sophia's words echoed in my head. Let them show you who they are first. So I left them standing there with their contractors and their architectural plans and their complete inability to see what they were destroying. And I drove home and waited for the other shoe to drop. 2 months after Sophia's death, my father called and told me I needed to come to his condo downtown for a family meeting. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request or an invitation. It was a summons. I drove there on a Sunday afternoon with a sense of impending doom, knowing something bad was coming, but not quite able to imagine how bad it would actually be. When I arrived, the champagne was already chilling, and there was an elaborate spread of expensive Italian food from a caterer that charged more for one meal than Sophia spent on groceries in a month. My parents were practically vibrating with excitement and self-satisfaction, and the second I walked through the door, I knew exactly what had happened. I need to pause here for a second, because this is the moment everything changed. The moment I understood with absolute clarity that my grandmother had been right about everything. My parents hadn't just disrespected her memory, or ignored her wishes, or valued money over meaning. They'd committed actual fraud, selling property they had no legal right to sell, and they were standing there expecting me to celebrate with them. If you've ever watched family treat an inheritance like it belonged to them before the person was even cold in the ground, drop greed in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping family peace and standing up for what's right, type justice. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens next, the lawsuit, the criminal investigation, the complete destruction of their lives, shows that sometimes doing the right thing means watching people you love face the consequences they spent their whole lives thinking they'd never have to pay. We have incredible news, my mother announced the second I sat down, barely able to contain her excitement. The sale closed yesterday. Final price was $1.35 million, even better than the initial offer. The developers were so impressed with how smoothly everything went that they added a premium to the purchase price. She poured champagne into 3 glasses like we were celebrating a promotion instead of the destruction of my grandmother's legacy. After all the closing costs, agent fees, legal expenses, and estate administration costs, Elena, your portion is $485,000. We've already set up a meeting with our financial advisor for next week to help you invest it properly so you don't waste it on something impulsive. This is life-changing money if you're smart about it. The room spun. The glass of champagne she'd pushed toward me blurred in and out of focus. I gripped the edge of the table with both hands to keep myself from falling out of the chair. You sold it, I said, my voice hollow and distant, like it was coming from someone else's body. You actually sold Nonna's house.
We've been telling you this was happening for 2 months, my father said, his tone annoyed that I seemed surprised instead of grateful. Why do you look shocked? The timeline was always aggressive because of market conditions. Demolition starts next week, actually. The developers want to break ground before winter to stay on schedule. First condo units should be ready for occupancy in about 18 months.
You sold our family home to be demolished, I said again, still trying to make my brain accept what my ears were hearing. You sold the house where Nonna lived for 60 years, where she raised 3 children as a widow, where she taught me everything I know about cooking and gardening and what actually matters in life. You sold it to strangers who are going to tear it down and build luxury condos, and you're celebrating with champagne.
We sold a deteriorating property in a prime location for excellent market value, my mother corrected, her voice taking on that edge it always had when she was explaining reality to naive people who didn't understand how the world worked. There's a significant difference, Elena. Your grandmother lived a simple, modest life, but that doesn't mean she'd want her descendants to make poor financial decisions with the assets she left behind. This is exactly what any rational person would do with property in this condition, in this location. She'd want us to be smart about this, to maximize value, to set ourselves and future generations up for financial success. That was the moment I knew with absolute certainty that my grandmother had been right about everything. My parents would say anything, believe anything, rewrite any history to justify their greed and erase their guilt. They'd convince themselves that Sophia, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep that house, who'd refused every buyout offer for 40 years, who'd told me 1,000 times that some things mattered more than money, would want them to demolish her home for profit. They'd rewritten her entire life story to fit their narrative of smart financial planning, and they genuinely believed their own lies. I need to leave, I said, standing up so fast the champagne glass tipped over and spilled across their expensive table. I don't feel well. Elena, don't be dramatic, my father said. Sit down. We need to discuss the financial planning meeting and go over some paperwork you need to sign. I said I need to leave. My voice came out harder than I'd intended. I'll deal with paperwork later. I can't be here right now. I walked out before they could stop me, before I said or did something I couldn't take back, before I pulled out the envelope and destroyed them right there in their luxury condo. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind replaying the image of them celebrating over champagne and Italian food, while planning the demolition of everything Sophia had built and loved. That night, finally, I opened the envelope Sophia had given me 3 days before she died. Inside were the property transfer documents, officially transferring 47 Maple Street from Sophia Castellano to Elena Rose Martinez, dated 4 years earlier, notarized, witnessed, recorded with Suffolk County. There were also bank statements showing Sophia had paid all property taxes herself from the transfer date forward, establishing a clear paper trail of ownership. And there was a letter in Sophia's shaky handwriting, the last thing she ever wrote to me. My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, your father has shown his true heart just as I knew he would. I knew he would sell our home the moment I was gone. I knew he would see only money where there should be memory, only development potential where there should be respect for what came before. Your father has spent his whole life trying to erase where he came from, ashamed of the immigrant mother and the working-class neighborhood, and the modest house that remind him he wasn't born to the wealth he's so desperate to convince everyone he's always had. So I protected what matters the only way I could. I put this house in your hands 4 years ago, long before cancer, when my mind was clear and my intentions could never be questioned. The house is yours, Elena. It always was yours, from the moment I signed these papers. Your father cannot sell what he does not own. Use these documents. Protect our home. Fight for what matters.
even when the people you're fighting are your own blood. And remember always, family is not biology. It is love and respect and shared values. Some people are related by blood, but strangers by choice, connected by nothing but DNA and obligation. You are my true family because you understand what I built and why it matters. Ti amo sempre, per sempre, nonna. I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by legal documents until the sun came up, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, like Sophia's hand on my shoulder. My parents hadn't just disrespected her memory, or made poor decisions, or acted insensitively during grief. They'd committed actual fraud. They'd sold property they had no legal right to sell, using forged or outdated documentation, accepting over $1 million for something that belonged to me. And they'd done it with such arrogance and confidence that they'd invited me to celebrate their crime with champagne. The next morning, I called Maria Constantino, Sophia's attorney. She listened to the entire story without interrupting, asked me to bring every document to her office immediately, and 3 hours later sat across from me with an expression that mixed professional outrage with personal anger. "Your grandmother was brilliant," Maria said, reviewing the deed transfer and cross-referencing it with county records on her computer. "She saw exactly what your father would do, and she protected the property years in advance. Everything here is perfectly legal, properly executed, and completely binding. The transfer was recorded 4 years ago, which means the house hasn't been part of Sophia's estate since then." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Your parents just committed textbook real estate fraud. They sold property they didn't own, accepted payment for something they had no right to sell, and did it while your father was serving as executor of an estate. Which makes it even worse, because he was in a position of trust and legal responsibility." "This is serious, Elena. Criminal charges serious." She paused to let that sink in. "If you pursue this, you'll void the sale, recover the property, and your parents will face massive financial liability at minimum, possibly criminal prosecution. Your relationship with them will be destroyed completely and permanently. There's no walking this back once we file. Are you absolutely certain you're prepared for that?" I thought about Sophia's garden, scheduled to be bulldozed in a week. About her kitchen where 3 generations had learned to cook, about to be demolished for luxury condo development. About my parents toasting with champagne over a fraudulent sale while using Sophia's name for the building that would replace everything she'd loved. "They destroyed the relationship when they erased Nona like she never existed," I said quietly. "I'm just making them face reality and consequences for what they chose to do." Maria nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then let's burn their world down." 4 days later, Richard and Diana Martinez were served with legal notice at their respective offices, in front of colleagues and clients, which was deliberate strategy on Maria's part. The document stated clearly and unambiguously, the sale of 47 Maple Street was null and void due to fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership. Richard Martinez had no legal authority to sell said property. Elena Rose Martinez was the legal owner and had been since 4 years prior to Sofia Castellano's death. Richard and Diana Martinez were being sued for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of assets, and unjust enrichment. Attached as exhibits were copies of the deed showing me as owner, the county recording from 4 years ago, bank statements showing Sofia paying taxes, and Maria's notarized affidavit confirming everything. The response was immediate and explosive. 17 phone calls in the first hour, text messages that started furious. "What the hell is this?" Then shifted to confused. "This has to be some kind of mistake." Then devolved into desperate. "Elena, please, we can fix this. Just call us." I didn't answer any of them. I blocked their numbers and let them panic. Let them feel a fraction of the violation and helplessness I'd felt, watching them destroy Sofia's legacy. Then came the voicemails, progressively more unhinged. My father's voice barely controlled. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you need to call me back immediately. This lawsuit is insane. Your grandmother never would have done this without telling me.
Someone clearly defrauded her or forged these documents, and you're being manipulated. Call me back right now. My mother, crying. Elena, sweetheart, please. There has to be some terrible mistake. Your nonna loved your father. She wouldn't have cut him out of inheriting the house. Someone took advantage of her when she was old and confused.
We need to work together to figure out what happened here. Please call me. More from my father, angrier.
Fine, don't call back. But you're making the biggest mistake of your life. We have a legal binding contract with buyers who paid $1.35 million. We have documentation. Our lawyers are going to destroy this ridiculous claim, and you're going to end up with nothing except massive legal bills and a destroyed relationship with your family. That evening, they showed up at my apartment, pounding on the door so hard my neighbors came out to see what was happening. I stood on the other side, listening to them shout and threaten for a full minute before I opened the door. I didn't invite them in. I stood in the doorway, blocking entry, looked at their faces, my father purple with rage, my mother's makeup streaked with tears, and felt absolutely nothing but cold certainty that this was right. You sold my house, I said calmly. Your house? My father's voice went up an octave.
That's absolutely insane. That's delusional. The will clearly stated the property was divided between us. You're trying to steal what's rightfully— The will divided Nona's estate, I interrupted, my voice steady and calm, which seemed to enrage him further. But the house wasn't part of her estate, because she didn't own it when she died. She transferred it to me 4 years ago. Legal deed transfer, properly executed, recorded with the county, completely binding and irrevocable. You can verify it yourself. County records are public. I held up the documents. You sold property you didn't own, Papa. That's fraud. My mother grabbed my father's arm to steady herself, her perfect composure completely shattered. This can't be real. This has to be some kind of fraud or forgery. Your grandmother would never have done something like this without telling us, without at least discussing it with your father. She wouldn't have hidden it for 4 years. Someone must have taken advantage of her, manipulated her when she was sick and vulnerable. She did it 4 years before she got sick, I said, when she was completely healthy and mentally sharp and working with her attorney to make absolutely sure it was legal and binding and impossible to contest. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. She knew you'd try to sell the house the second she died, so she made sure you couldn't. She protected what mattered from the people who only saw dollar signs.
We have buyers,
My father shouted.
We have a binding legal contract. People who paid $1.35 million in good faith. The demolition is scheduled. You can't just—
I can, and I am, I said. The sale is void. You'll have to return every dollar plus interest and penalties. You'll probably get sued by the developers for fraud and breach of contract. That's your problem, not mine. You created this disaster when you sold something that wasn't yours to sell. The legal battle that followed was exactly as vicious as Maria had predicted it would be. My parents hired one of Boston's most aggressive law firms, a team of attorneys who specialized in estate litigation, and their strategy was as desperate as it was ugly. They argued undue influence, claiming I'd systematically manipulated and isolated an elderly, sick woman, turned her against her own son, and coerced her into signing over valuable property while she was mentally compromised by illness and grief over her husband's death decades earlier. Their legal filings painted me as a predatory opportunist who'd spent years grooming Sophia for this exact outcome, using my position as favorite granddaughter to exploit her for financial gain. They had to essentially argue that their own mother was senile and easily manipulated, and that their own daughter was cruel enough to exploit that vulnerability. They made those arguments in court documents, in depositions taken under oath, in front of judges and attorneys and court reporters who transcribed every vicious word. But Sophia had anticipated this exact strategy, and she'd prepared for it with the same meticulous care she'd used for everything important in her life.
Maria produced evidence that demolished their entire case, piece by piece. Medical records showing Sophia had been in perfect mental health 4 years ago when the transfer occurred, with cognitive assessments from her doctor scoring her as sharp and competent. Video testimony Sophia had recorded with Maria's help, sitting in Maria's office looking directly at the camera and explaining her decision in both English and Italian with perfect clarity and obvious sound mind. Witnesses including Maria, Sophia's doctor, and several longtime friends who could testify that Sophia had discussed her intentions openly and had made this choice freely without any pressure from me.
The most devastating evidence was the video Sophia had made. In it, she sat in a chair in Maria's office, 82 years old and healthy, looking directly at the camera with those fierce eyes I remembered so well. "My name is Sofia Castellano," she said in English, then repeated it in Italian. "I am 82 years old and of completely sound mind and body. I am making this recording to prevent any future claims that I was confused or manipulated when I transferred my house to my granddaughter Elena. I made this decision freely, deliberately, and for very specific reasons that I want to explain clearly." She leaned forward slightly. "My son Richard has spent his entire adult life being ashamed of where he came from. He changed his name to hide his Italian heritage. He married into old money and built a career in luxury real estate because he wanted to erase every trace of the working-class immigrant family he was born into.
He sees my house as an embarrassment because it reminds him and his wealthy friends that he wasn't born to the life he's so desperate to pretend he's always had. He has spent years asking me to sell, to update, to modernize, always focused on property value and never once understanding what that house actually means." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was sad but certain. "I know what Richard will do when I die. He will sell my house immediately. He will tear it down and build something expensive and modern. He will erase every trace of the life I built there, the memories I made there, the love that fills every room. He will do this not because he needs money, but because that house embarrasses him, and he cannot wait to destroy the evidence of his humble origins. So I have protected what matters the only way I can, by giving the house to the one person in my family who understands what it represents beyond market value."
The video continued for another 10 minutes, with Sophia explaining in detail her relationship with me, our shared love of cooking and gardening, the time we spent together, the values she'd tried to pass forward. She talked about Richard with obvious sadness, acknowledging that some distance between them was her fault for working so much when he was young, but also clearly stating that his shame about his background and his obsession with wealth and status had created an unbridgeable gap between them. By the time the video ended with Sophia looking at the camera and saying, "This is my choice, made freely, and anyone who tries to take this house from Elena is disrespecting my clearly stated wishes," my parents' case was obliterated. Their attorneys tried everything, claiming the video was coached, arguing Sophia had deteriorated after it was recorded, suggesting I'd somehow manipulated her before the video was made. But Maria had more evidence. Letters Sophia had written to her over the years. Witnesses who could testify to Sophia's mental sharpness, even months before her death. Financial records showing Sophia had paid all the property taxes herself after the transfer, establishing that she'd treated me as the true owner for 4 full years. The undue influence argument collapsed completely. The judge ruled in my favor on every single point. The fraudulent sale was voided. My parents were ordered to return the full $1.35 million to the developers, plus interest and legal fees. The property was confirmed as mine, with no compensation owed to anyone. And because my father had been serving as executor when he committed the fraud, the judge also removed him as executor and appointed an independent administrator to handle the remaining estate matters. But the consequences didn't stop with the civil judgment. The developers who'd bought the house in good faith, who'd already spent tens of thousands on permits and architectural plans and demolition scheduling, were furious about the fraud. They sued my parents separately for damages, fraud, breach of contract, and legal fees. That lawsuit was still ongoing, but was likely to cost my parents hundreds of thousands more. The district attorney's office, alerted by the judge's ruling and the developer's complaint, opened a criminal investigation into the fraudulent sale. My father had signed closing documents under penalty of perjury, claiming he had legal authority to sell the property. He'd accepted over $1 million for something he had no right to sell. He'd done this while serving as executor, a position of legal trust. Prosecutors took it very seriously. Only my parents' previously clean records and their extremely expensive criminal defense attorneys prevented actual jail time. They eventually accepted a plea deal that required them to pay nearly $100,000 in fines, complete 200 hours of community service each, and serve 5 years of probation, with strict terms stating that any violation would result in immediate incarceration. They also had to allocate a permanent record, fraud convictions that would follow them forever in background checks and professional licensing, and anywhere their past mattered. The professional consequences somehow ended up being even more devastating than illegal ones. My father's entire career was built on reputation and trust in Boston's tight-knit luxury real estate development community. When news of his fraud convictions spread, and it spread fast because real estate circles in Boston overlap and everyone gossips, his business partners started distancing themselves. Investors pulled out of projects. The firm he'd spent 20 years building asked him to resign to protect their reputation. He went from being a major player in Boston real estate to essentially unemployable in his own industry within 6 months. My mother's consulting business likewise depended entirely on her network and reputation. When her clients learned about the fraud case, about her involvement in selling properties she knew or should have known they didn't own, contracts were quietly canceled. Her carefully curated image as a sophisticated professional from old money was destroyed by association with criminal fraud. Within a year, her business had collapsed entirely, and she was forced to take a corporate job at a quarter of her previous income. The social consequences destroyed what remained of their carefully constructed lives. My parents had spent decades building connections in Boston's elite circles, country club memberships, charity boards, exclusive social events where old money and new money mingled. That world operates entirely on reputation and perception, and scandal makes you radioactive. Invitations stopped coming. People they'd considered close friends suddenly couldn't return phone calls. They went from being sought-after guests at every important event to being quietly uninvited from everything that mattered to them. I watched all of this unfold from a careful distance, getting updates from Maria, and occasionally seeing mentions of the case in legal newsletters, or hearing gossip that filtered back to me through mutual acquaintances, who didn't realize I was the Elena at the center of everything. I felt complicated things about it all. I hadn't wanted to destroy my parents' entire lives. I'd wanted to save Sophia's house and make them face consequences for what they'd done. But consequences have their own momentum once they start, cascading through every connected system in ways you can't control or scale back. What they'd done was fraud, and fraud has ripple effects that touch everything: legal status, professional reputation, social standing, financial stability, all of it interconnected and all of it vulnerable when the foundation cracks. Meanwhile, I had to decide what to actually do with the house now that I'd fought so hard to save it. Multiple developers contacted me offering millions for the property. One offer went as high as $1.8 million, significantly more than what my parents had gotten. I could have taken the money, walked away financially set for life, and told myself I'd done my part by stopping my parents' fraud. But standing in Sophia's kitchen one afternoon 3 months after the legal settlement, smelling the faint scent of oregano and tomato sauce that seemed permanently embedded in the walls, running my hands over the counter where I'd learned to roll pasta, I knew what my grandmother would want, and what I wanted too. I moved into 47 Maple Street 4 months after the legal settlement ended. I hired contractors, but gave them very specific instructions. Preserve everything that mattered, update only what was necessary for safety and function. They rewired the electrical system that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, replaced old plumbing, fixed the roof, repainted inside and out. But they kept Sophia's kitchen layout exactly as it was, maintained the garden structure, preserved all the architectural details and character that made the house what it was. I wasn't trying to freeze the house in time like a museum, but I was absolutely refusing to erase it or modernize it into something unrecognizable. I used the ground floor to open Nonna's Kitchen, a small bakery and cafe serving traditional Italian pastries and foods made from Sophia's recipes that I'd spent years learning and perfecting. I kept the menu simple: fresh bread baked every morning, pasta made by hand, cannoli and sfogliatelle and pignoli cookies, exactly the way Sophia had taught me. I hung photos of her on the walls, included her story in the menu, made sure everyone who walked through the door understood that this wasn't just a business, it was a legacy, a preservation of something that mattered more than profit. The neighborhood embraced Nonna's Kitchen immediately and enthusiastically. Former neighbors who'd known Sophia for decades came in to share memories and taste familiar foods, and cry a little while telling me stories about things she'd done for them over the years. Young families discovered authentic Italian baking that actually tasted like their own grandmother's cooking, instead of the commercialized versions sold at chain bakeries. Food bloggers found me and wrote about the experience of eating in a real family home instead of a designed space. My own food blog, which I'd maintained for years as a hobby, became a place where I documented Sophia's recipes along with the stories behind them, the history and tradition and love that made food more than just calories and ingredients. The blog's following grew from a few hundred people to tens of thousands who were hungry for exactly what I was offering: authenticity, connection, tradition, the antidote to a world that increasingly felt plastic and disposable. 6 months after opening Nonna's Kitchen, on a random Tuesday afternoon during the lunch rush, a woman walked in who I immediately recognized, even though I'd been actively avoiding thinking about her. My mother, looking smaller and older and less polished than I'd ever seen her, wearing ordinary clothes instead of designer labels, standing in the doorway of Sophia's house like she wasn't sure she had permission to enter. I was in the middle of serving customers and couldn't just stop everything, so I gestured for her to sit at a small table in the corner and told her I'd be with her when I could. She sat quietly for almost an hour, not ordering anything, just watching me work and looking around at what I'd done with the space. When the lunch rush finally ended and I could take a break, I sat down across from her without saying anything, waiting to see what she wanted. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story reminded you that protecting what matters doesn't make you the villain, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Have you ever had to choose between keeping family peace and doing what's right? Did you stand your ground, or did you give in? I read every single one. If you know someone dealing with family treating an inheritance like it belongs to everyone except who it was left to, share this with them. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this. I'll see you in the next one. Your boundaries aren't betrayal, they're survival. And the people who truly love you will respect them.